Hello, welcome back. Hope you're all doing well. Now, if this case was a film, it would go straight to DVD because no one would believe it. They'd say the storyline was too far-fetched. Now, everything in this case is still alleged. All of the details are what the prosecution are alleging. No one's actually been found guilty or not guilty yet. I just want to make that clear. Daniel Craig Brophy was born June 27th, 1954 to Karen and Jack Brophy, and for most of his adult life he worked in the food industry. In the 70s he worked at Jake's Crawfish in downtown Portland. He then worked at the Western Culinary for a decade, and then he taught at a cooking school called In Good Taste. Then in 2006 he became part of the original faculty at the Oregon Culinary Institute. Dan was described as a one-of-a-kind human being. He enjoyed gardening and mushroom hunting, and he had a wicked sense of humour. He was brilliant and generous. He had a gruff demeanour but a heart of gold, and he was very good at what he did. He was described as a walking encyclopedia of all things food at the Culinary Institute where he worked. Dan was most known for his sense of humour. He had these little sayings that the students would refer to as Brophyisms. He would do funny things. He would make the students wear helmets and sombreros if they forgot their chef's hats. Dan was also a giving person. He would feed the homeless downtown with the food that was left over from the Culinary Institute. It's clear that he was a well-loved, well-respected man. It was the morning of June 2nd, 2018, and Dan was the first to arrive at his place of work, the OCI, the Oregon Culinary Institute. Dan was the lead chef instructor there, and they used to teach weekend courses, so that Saturday he turned up to start work. As he was the first one there, he actually set off the security alarms in the building. So he disarms those at 7:21 a.m. and starts prepping for the day. One of Dan's colleagues arrives about 10 minutes after him at 7:30 a.m. and opens the doors ready for the students to arrive at 8 a.m. And what the students find on entering the kitchen was absolutely horrifying. The students enter the kitchen to find Dan Brophy unconscious on the floor. He's been shot at close range and is covered in blood. One student tries to give him CPR and the other one calls 911. By the time the medics arrive, Dan has already died at the scene, aged 63 years old. Portland police arrive on the scene and find 9mm shell casings next to Dan's body. No one saw what happened and there's no description of who did this. Police ruled out a robbery pretty much straight away. Dan's wallet, phone, car keys and his car were all still there at the scene. There was no sign of a struggle, no forced entry, and there were no other victims. What investigators could say at this point was that it was a homicide, and what likely happened was Dan was stood at the sink when he was shot. The first bullet penetrated his spine and paralysed him, and the second bullet penetrated his heart. Not long after the police arrived at the school, Nancy, Dan's wife, arrived. Nancy was known at the school. Dan would talk about her all the time. He would refer to himself as the chef and Nancy as the management. Police asked Nancy if she could think of anyone who would want to do this to Dan. Did he have any enemies? And Nancy said no, she couldn't think of anyone, and neither could anyone else. So the investigation got off to a difficult start because there was no obvious suspects. Nancy and Dan had been married for 27 years. He was 63 and she was almost 68. They lived together in Portland with, as Nancy described, 2 Shih Tzus, PB&J, and 40 rowdy chickens. They were described by neighbours as a happy, well-suited couple, so when Dan was killed, of course, Nancy was devastated. She wrote a post on Facebook about it the next day. She said, "For my Facebook friends and family, I have sad news to relate. My husband and best friend, Chef Dan Brophy, was killed yesterday morning. For those of you who are close to me and feel this deserved a phone call, you are right, but I'm struggling to make sense of everything right now. There is a candlelit vigil at Oregon Culinary Institute tomorrow, Monday, 4th of June at 7 p.m. Whilst I appreciate all of your loving responses, I am overwhelmed. Please save phone calls for a few days until I can function." The vigil took place the next day at the Culinary Institute and hundreds of people showed up. Nancy was visibly upset, but she managed to say a few words. She said he loved teaching, he loved mushrooms, and he loved family. Dan was one of the very few people I've known that knew exactly what he wanted in life and loved doing it. As the days passed, neighbours would spot Nancy out and about walking her dogs. They would offer their condolences and she would say that she was having a really hard time. She just couldn't get her head around what had happened. There was no obvious suspect in this case, so it'd gone cold pretty much immediately. The students at the OCI were understandably scared. They'd seen their teacher get gunned down and no arrests had been made. As the weeks went by, Nancy started talking to her neighbours about moving. She felt like she was haunted by Dan's side of the bedroom. Thinking about him upset her and she just wanted to move away and make a fresh start, so she decided to put the house up for sale. But as it turns out, Nancy didn't get to move house, because on September 5th, 2018, Portland police arrived at her house. They arrested her and charged her with unlawful use of a weapon and murder. Nancy was sent to Multnomah County Detention Centre. She pleaded not guilty and her request for bail was rejected due to enough probable cause. On her arrest, people were shocked. They couldn't believe that Nancy was capable of something like this. They'd been married for 3 decades and there was no obvious reason why she'd been arrested. But a few months later, in April 2019, some court records that had previously been sealed were opened. These records revealed why Nancy had been arrested and what police thought the motive behind the shooting was, and it made for jaw-dropping reading. Nancy told police that the last time she saw Dan was when he left for work at 7 a.m, and that she didn't leave the house after that until the school rang her to tell her about the shooting, and that's when she made her way across. However, according to an affidavit submitted by County Prosecutor Sean Overstreet, at 7:08 a.m, CCTV allegedly spotted Nancy driving her Toyota minivan west on Jefferson Street directly past the Culinary Institute. If you remember, it was 7:21 that Dan disarmed the security alarms in the building that morning. Then at 7:28, Nancy was again allegedly spotted on CCTV driving past the Culinary Institute on Jefferson Street. When Nancy was being interviewed, she told police that she and Dan had bought a 9mm gun at a gun show that year, but that they'd never bought ammunition for it and that they'd never used it. When police seized the gun from Nancy's house, they had it tested, and it wasn't the gun that was used in the shooting. Now, you may remember that the bullet casings surrounding Dan's body were 9mm bullet casings, just like Nancy's gun, so the police dug a little deeper. Before the shooting, Nancy had googled ghost guns and had bought a Glock gun kit from a Ghost Guns website. She'd also bought a Glock slide and barrel from eBay. Now, I don't know anything about guns, so that completely went over my head, so let me just explain to you what the police are alleging Nancy did. Prosecutors allege that she took the gun she bought at the gun show and took the slide and barrel out of it. She put the slide and barrel she bought on eBay into the gun, shot Dan, and then took the eBay slide and barrel out of the gun, put the show slide and barrel back in the gun, and presented a totally unused gun to police. Did that make any sense? Basically, she took the insides of the gun out, put different insides in, allegedly shot Dan, took the insides out and put the other insides back in. I don't know if that helped. When she presented the gun to police, it would show up as never having been used, and the casings wouldn't match that found at the scene. She also deleted her eBay account a few days after the killing. So now we have the alleged means, but what about the alleged motive? They seem to be a happy couple. They've been married for 30 years. What reason could Nancy possibly have to literally shoot her husband in the heart? Well, things weren't going that well financially for Nancy and Dan, and they hadn't been for a while. They were literally living paycheck to paycheck. They were $6,000 behind in mortgage payments. Even though they were in real financial trouble, Nancy always paid on time and in full her monthly life insurance payments. Whilst they were $6,000 behind in mortgage payments, Nancy paid up to $16,000 towards life insurance premiums. Police then found out that Nancy used to work in the insurance industry. She used to sell life insurance, so she sold herself those policies and she was the sole beneficiary of them. Nancy had one life insurance policy for Dan and that was worth up to $40,000, and then she had various other policies that were worth up to $350,000. And one thing that I didn't even think about was that Dan was killed at work, so Nancy would also be entitled to a workers' compensation claim. Dan used to be the sole owner of their house, but in 2017 he decided to put Nancy's name on the deeds as well, so they had joint ownership. And if you remember, shortly before her arrest, Nancy put the house up for sale. So all in, the life policies, the workers' compensation and the house, Nancy stood to collect up to $1.5 million due to the untimely death of her husband. Friends of Nancy had told police that Nancy had expressed a wish to sell up the house and go travelling the world, but she'd said that Dan would be much more difficult to convince. The police alleged that Nancy was fed up of her meagre surroundings. Whilst Dan was happy in his simplistic life, she wasn't. She wanted more. Now, just because Nancy stood to inherit a lot of money doesn't mean that she was wanting her husband dead. A lot of people do stand to inherit a lot of money upon the death of their relatives. It doesn't mean they want it to happen, or that they're even thinking about that money. However, 3 days after Dan died, Nancy called Detective Darren Pawsey. She asked that he would write a letter confirming that she was not a suspect in her husband's death so that she could access the life insurance policies. So 3 days after Dan's death would have been June 5th. June 4th was Dan's vigil that Nancy attended and spoke at. Detective Darren Pawsey declined Nancy's request. Police then searched Dan's phone for clues, and what they found on an iTunes account that he shared with his wife Nancy was an article bookmarked 10 Ways to Cover Up a Murder. I did say this was jaw-dropping, but believe it or not, it actually gets worse. What I've left out of the story so far was that Nancy was a writer. She described herself as a romantic suspense writer, and her stories were about, and I quote, pretty men and strong women, families that don't always work, and the joy of finding love and the difficulty of making it stay. Given that they were in financial trouble, Nancy tried to make money out of the stories that she wrote. She would publish them herself on Amazon, but they didn't do very well and they didn't bring much money in. One of her self-published books in 2015 was The Wrong Husband, which involved a couple in trouble and involved a life insurance policy worth several $1 million that one half of the fictional couple were trying to claim on. Then there was another book, The Wrong Cop, where a woman spends every day of her marriage fantasising about killing her husband. But before either of these publications, in 2011, Nancy wrote a piece published on a forum for female writers named See Jane Publish. The 700-word essay was titled How to Kill Your Husband. Now, this is a tongue-in-cheek essay where she takes on the persona of a woman who wants to kill her husband. In the essay she says, divorce is expensive, do you really want to split all of your possessions? And if you married for money, aren't you entitled to all of it? The drawback is the police aren't stupid, they'll be looking at you first, so you need to be organised, ruthless and very clever. She then goes on to say, guns are loud and messy. If it takes 10 shots for the sucker to die, then either you have terrible aim or he's on drugs. At the end she goes on to write, I find it easier to wish people dead than to actually kill them, and really I'm not very good at remembering lies. Nancy's How to Murder Your Husband essay has since been made private. In 2012, Nancy wrote in another blog, as a writer I think a lot about murder and consequently police procedure. As far as murder is concerned, I think everyone has it in them to do it if they are pushed far enough. Murder, mayhem and gore seem to come naturally to me, which is why my husband has learned to sleep with one eye open. As you can imagine, once these court documents were unsealed and the content of Nancy's writing was revealed, she made headlines. Nancy herself in 2014 wrote, my mother used to say, never write anything that you'll later need to defend in court. And by 2018, Nancy was in prison, charged with the murder of her husband after previously having published an essay with the title, How to Murder Your Husband. Now I know that when people write, they're not necessarily writing about themselves. There are plenty of crime writers who are writing about crimes but are not actually committing them. But this is just so shocking that someone who wrote an essay titled How to Murder Your Husband is now in prison charged with murdering her husband. So now we've arrived at the present day in the timeline of this case, but a few things have happened whilst Nancy has been awaiting trial. In March 2020, Nancy's lawyers tried to get her released due to the thing that shall not be named that's keeping us all on lockdown right now. They argued that she was at risk of imminent death if she stayed in prison. Because of her age, she's 69 years old right now and has a diabetic condition. Her lawyers argued that she was at risk. But the prison that she's in right now holds up to 1,200 inmates and there isn't one case in there at the moment. They argued that she should go to a private guest house and be under surveillance 24 hours a day, but the judge rejected their request. Another thing that's happened is Nathaniel Stillwater, who is the son of Dan and the stepson of Nancy, has filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Nancy, saying she murdered his father. Nathaniel's civil lawsuit seeks up to $1.7 million in damages from Nancy. He's asking for damages relating to Dan's pain and the suffering before he died, the loss of the Brophy estate and his own personal parental loss. Nathaniel said they're just trying to protect his father's assets, but that lawsuit will be on hold until the criminal trial has taken place. Usually a person is entitled to their spouse's assets if the spouse dies, but in Oregon there is a slayer statute which is designed specifically to stop people from profiting from their crimes. So if Nancy is deemed to be a slayer in this scenario, she won't be entitled to anything. Another strange thing's happened too, which is prosecutors have said they have proof that Nancy is engaged in ongoing criminal behaviour whilst in custody. They said some of Nancy's jail visitors might be complicit in other crimes. There's been no other information given than that, and I can't think of what it could be. No trial date has been set for this case yet. It could take up to a year for this trial to happen. If convicted, Nancy faces life imprisonment with a minimum 25-year sentence. The students and staff at the OCI where Dan worked were devastated and have pledged that they will continue to honour his memory by educating future culinary professionals to carry the baton and make Dan proud. People who have known Nancy for years are convinced that she didn't do this. There's no reason why she would kill him. She absolutely adored him. But the police say otherwise. The police say the bottom line is Dan Brophy was worth almost $1.5 million to Nancy Brophy if he was dead, and he was worth a life of financial hardship if he stayed alive. Nancy Brophy planned and carried out what she believed was the perfect murder, a murder that she believed would free her from the grips of financial despair and enter a life of financial security and adventure. This case is very much an example of truth being stranger than fiction, but it's also a really sad case. Dan Brophy was obviously a well-loved, well-respected man. He cared about his work and his students, and they cared about him. As I say, no one's been found guilty or not guilty in this case yet. Everything in this video is alleged. When the trial does happen, I'll do an update video to let you know what went on and what details came out, and of course what the verdict was. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give me a like and subscribe if you did. I've got a lot more videos planned and I'd love for you to stick around to see them. Have a great day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.